Welcome to our 2022 Justice in Focus Water Stories series. This is co-hosted by HopgoodGanim Lawyers and Caxton Legal Centre, and in recognition of the Australian Water Association's National Water Week. Again, welcome and happy Water Week. For those of you I don't know, my name is Leanne Collingburn. I'm Head of Pro Bono here at HopgoodGanim Lawyers, and I'm also a committee management committee member at Caxton Legal Centre.
And I'm Jacqui Cavanagh. I'm the flood recovery lawyer at Caxton.
So we will shortly introduce you to our guest with us today. But before we do, I wanted to start by acknowledging country. So we're on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people here in Meanjin, Brisbane. I want to pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today or joining us online. In the context of this discussion and acknowledging country, I also want to acknowledge that we have, through our First Nations peoples in Australia, over 65,000 years of knowledge in terms of land and water management. And as we discuss and explore best practice through this series in terms of water management, I'd encourage everyone to lean into First Nations voices and lean into that knowledge so that we can all do disaster preparedness and response and land and water management much better in the future. I also want to acknowledge the beautiful artwork that we have that has been this Water Stories series. And you can see behind us the image of the 3 impact icons that are incorporated into that artwork. The artist is Frances Bell Parker. She's from the Yagle community in northern New South Wales. And the artwork was commissioned by HopgoodGanim Lawyers to represent our 3 pro bono priority areas of working with First Nations communities, mitigating the impact of environmental disasters and reducing domestic and family violence. And I'll now hand over to Jacqui to talk about the purpose of our campaign.
Our 2022 Justice in Focus Water Story series shines a light on land and water management and disaster planning and response through a lens of human rights. Through a series of pre-recorded interviews and our live event today, we're exploring multidisciplinary responses to environmental disasters and climate change in Australia, particularly the more recent flood events in Queensland and in northern New South Wales. By sharing the water stories of our guest speakers, we hope to better understand our responses and preparedness for environmental disasters. This Justice in Focus Water Stories series aims to generate discussion and encouragement for human rights-centred approaches and responses across all the actions relating to land, law and people. It's my pleasure today to introduce our guest, Naomi Moran. Naomi is a Bundjalung and Dunghutti woman from New South Wales and is the General Manager of Australia's only independent Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander fortnightly newspaper, the Koori Mail. The paper is 100% Aboriginal owned and run, and Koori Mail's head office on Molesworth Street in Lismore is also very proudly 100% Aboriginal owned and run. Her career in Indigenous media spans over 20 years and includes experience in print, television and radio. At just 14, Naomi joined the Koori Mail as a trainee office worker, and for the next 10 years she worked for the paper in various roles, including in advertising, sales, marketing and editorial. In 2008, she joined the communications team at NITV and then went into radio in a joint position with both the Brisbane Indigenous Media Association and the National Indigenous Radio Service. In 2016, Naomi returned to the Koori Mail as the General Manager. She also has a passion for supporting Indigenous youth with employment and career pathways through in-school programs and mentoring for students through the northern New South Wales region. Naomi, can you tell us a bit about the picture behind us?
Yeah, sure. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on country today and acknowledge that as a proud Bundjalung and Dunghutti woman that as part of my respects to this country, I acknowledge elders past and present, acknowledge their families and their communities, and particularly acknowledge the young people who we know will become strong leaders for the future and contribute to the sustainability of our culture and place in this country. I really appreciate the time to be here today, and definitely look forward to sharing. And look, I'm a pretty open book, so if you do get to know me, what you see is what you get, and really, I guess, proud of the work that we've done over the past 8 months to support our community, and definitely feel connected to today's theme. So thank you so much. The image that I've chosen today, I was going to put one up of me and my husband in our gumboots, and I thought, oh, don't do that, Naomi, do something else, because he'd hate me for that. But this is a beautiful image that was taken by Harper's Bazaar after they found out about the work that we were doing on site, in particular the leadership of our Bundjalung women on the ground supporting the flood recovery at the Koori Mail building. So as you can see, we've got a beautiful mix of our local elders, our aunties, you know, to us, they're all our mother figures, they're our caretakers and our protectors, and our young ones as well that have been supporting the amazing work throughout the Bundjalung region during this time. So this is a really special image. It's connected to a really special article that can be found online via Harper's Bazaar, but that's why I chose that image today, because it certainly has been about celebrating the strong leadership of our Indigenous women from our Bundjalung country.
And we're going to talk about the strong First Nations female leadership during this session as well. So we will come back to that, but that is a beautiful image. Naomi, you are a Bundjalung woman, as you've mentioned, so your traditional country is the Northern Rivers region. Can we just start by you just explaining your connection to that country and what it means to you?
Yeah, so on my mum's side is my Aboriginal heritage, and I only grew up with my mum. Grew up in a single parent family. My father's non-Indigenous, unfortunately passed away almost 10 years ago. So I have a strong connection to my mother's family and communities, and they're both from the Dunghutti Nation, so the Southwest Rocks down near Kempsey on the mid-north coast, and Cabbage Tree Island, which is situated near Wardell. And the traditional name of that area is Nyambul, or you can pronounce it as Nyangambul. So I have a connection to that area and also to the Byron Bay, Brunswick Heads region. So our connections there are through the Iraqal lines of the traditional owner group there. So my mum grew up on Cabbage Tree Island. Generations and generations of our family grew up on Cabbage Tree Island, and as you may know, that was one of the largest Aboriginal communities that was affected by the floods. It was completely wiped out. That whole entire island has to be completely rebuilt. So they're in the process of demolishing that island, which, as you can imagine, there's a lot of trauma at the moment still, some 8 months later, around the thought of these homes, you know, up to 30 homes surrounding that area that have to be demolished. And you know, on one side of the island, my grandmother and her 2 sisters, the 3 houses, they live side by side. So the 3 sisters on that side, and you know, even my mum, when she found out that that had to be demolished, she couldn't go down there and kind of say her last goodbyes to that area. It was too traumatic for her. So as you can imagine, a lot of family history, a lot of connection to that country, and yeah, it's a very kind of sad time at the moment. There's certainly a grieving process that's been happening since the floods.
And did you grow up on country there?
I didn't grow up on Cabbage Tree Island, but mainly grew up in Ballina, beautiful spot, and then back and forth between Ballina and Lismore. So as you mentioned earlier, I was a high school dropout, very frustrated grade 10 student. Loved learning, really excelled in English and history. You know, maths, not too much. I remember tormenting my maths teacher and doing army rolls down the corridors, and he'd have to come and chase me, and I just didn't engage whatsoever. But I really struggled with the learning environment of the school environment. So when the Koori Mail, called the school and said, we've got a trainee opportunity for a student, and I put my hand up, and luckily they chose me, and that's kind of been my journey ever since. So yeah, didn't graduate year 10, certainly didn't graduate year 12, but made the most of every opportunity that came my way since.
So your traditional country is Southwest Rocks, Byron area, and Cabbage Tree Island.
Cabbage Tree
You
Island.
certainly know pick some beautiful places.
Definitely an East Coast saltwater, proud New South Wales blues. South Sydney Rabbitohs loving girl.
Well, you're welcome here in Queensland.
Every time I cross that border, I go, oh. No, I definitely feel the love.
Excellent. So you mentioned the Koori Mail, and hopefully many in the audience are already familiar with the Koori Mail and online, but for those that aren't, can you just talk a little bit about what the Koori Mail does, and why it's so important?
Yeah, so the Koori Mail is, 32 years strong now as a proudly independent Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander newspaper, certainly not the Courier Mail. We do get a lot of confusion around that, but very proud to correct people in saying that we're one of Australia's longest running independent Indigenous media organisations. And, the Koori Mail, started by one person in 1991 who individually acknowledged that our people needed to have their voices heard. And that's certainly, the goal and the aim and the vision of all of our Indigenous media organisations and broadcasters around the country. Obviously, to sustain a product like a newspaper, it costs money. So at a time where, it was at risk of folding under the leadership of one person, the local community banded together and said, look, we've got to help establish and make sure that this is sustainable for the future. So now, for almost 30 years exactly, the Koori Mail has been 100% Aboriginal owned by 5 Aboriginal organisations that surround the Bundjalung region. So what that means is that as a for-profit business, every cent and dollar that goes back into the Koori Mail by advertising and subscription revenue, those 5 organisations are able to declare dividends and then put that money back into the Bundjalung community. So it's a really well-run, structure as an organisation, and it's 100% about the community. So absolutely grassroots. And those 5 owning organisations do everything from social housing, so they provide homes for people in the area. They health and wellbeing projects, domestic violence, family support, healthy lifestyles, support the elderly. So there's a lot going on behind the scenes than just producing a newspaper. And obviously I'm very proud of my connection to the newspaper, and in 2016 was able to come back full circle and take on the role as general manager.
And we work closely at HopgoodGanim with Triple A Media, so Jai Lawton, CEO there, who I know you know well.
Yep.
And Jai often talks about the importance of First Nations voices communicating messages to First Nations people, and how important that role is.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that as well? Why it's so important to have First Nations media and the communications, and in the context of discussions with Jai, who talk about really important messages that come out from government, etc. And it's one thing to get the messages out there, but it's another thing to ensure that they're heard. And that's why Koori Mail and organisations like it are so important.
Yeah, and I think I always, I'm really strong in the understanding that as Indigenous people in Australia, everything that we do or everything that we stand for is because we have to acknowledge that there is an Indigenous lens on everything, and certainly within the media landscape. So, unfortunately, Australia has this long history of mainstream media telling one-sided stories, or not having, that engagement and connection with our communities in the context that there's a great understanding of those messages and how that needs to be delivered. So certainly the long legacy, of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander media in this country, and the trailblazers, some that I've been really fortunate to learn from and be mentored by, means that work can continue, that everything that we do is to make sure that we're really advocating, for the voices of our people, but we're also protecting their voices as well. And, I'm sure you've come across articles or you've read stories or seen it on the TV where there's issues, whether it's death in custody or whether, it's the Aboriginal NRL player and racism, or the AFL player, or, whatever the subject is, that Indigenous lens and how we take that on as Indigenous media is really important to how that story is being told, and how the corrections are being made as well, because unfortunately there have been times where Indigenous media has had to step in and take on that story to make sure that that story is being told, you know, from the side of that person that's been affected by it. So, you know, like I said, very proud to be in the sector. I think, you know, it still blows my mind that we're in a time and place now in, you know, 2022 where we're really struggling to fund and support the Indigenous media sector, which does incredible work to support the voices of our people.
Can we go now to the floods from earlier this year? We know that on the 28th of February, the Northern Rivers region was impacted by the worst flood in recorded history. And then the community was hit a second time with a devastating flood on the 30th of March. The Koori Mail headquarters are right on the river and the building itself was damaged by floods. How has it affected you, your colleagues and your operations?
Yes. You know, totally acknowledging that the last 8 months is not my day job. You know, look, if I can go back to the week leading up to it, it was deja vu. The Koori Mail building is located, actually, this photograph is taken right in front. That cement behind us is the flood pump station at the end of town. So it just so happens that our building is right there. And in 2017, I remember sitting in my office window looking at the pump station because they have a digital clock up there. So as soon as the river reaches a certain height, this clock starts counting down. And back then we were in production week. It was a Friday. The waters were expected to hit around 1 a.m. Told my sister to go get me some Hungry Jacks and a blanket. And I decided, right or wrong, I was going to camp in my office because we were going into production. We were meant to print on the Sunday and there's no way that we're not going to print. We've never considered not printing. The SES saw my office light on, came banging on the door and had to rescue me. Then I get a phone call from my mother saying, you could have died. So it was this big drama. And I just went back to that time when that clock came on again and went, okay, here we go again. By that time, though, the warnings were, it could be the same as last time. We're still not sure yet. So in the event that it is, obviously our preparedness meant that we had to come in and elevate things to the highest point on the first level. On that Sunday, I was actually enjoying a weekend with my girlfriend on the Gold Coast, and my husband rings and goes, you need to see these updates. This is going to be bad. So I had to fly back, you know, get on the road and come back down from the Gold Coast. We went straight to the office again, tried to elevate the really important things to the highest point that we could. We were actually leading into production week then. That was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. By 11 o'clock at night, we got the final warning that it was going to exceed around, you know, 13, 14 metres. And I think at that point, people were just still really numb that this could actually happen. Like, what does that mean? How far is it going to get? We just couldn't comprehend that. So about midnight, we had an hour gap. So we had an hour to get down and do the most that we could. And unfortunately, you know, the best that we could do just wasn't enough. And like everybody else, we watched all the updates throughout the evening on social media. And, you know, I remember the next day just seeing how much the water had come in and just being completely in shock. And I think, you know, I knew that everything would have been gone. My husband, I didn't see him for about 2 days because he was part of the rescue. So he was one of the civilians that just got in boats and was rescuing people. You know, he's 6'4", big Fijian fella. And he said, oh, they're just going to get me to sandbag. I said, you're not going to be sandbagged. I said, you are not going to be sandbagging, trust me. And sure enough, he's out on a boat, no life jacket, pulling people out of houses. I remember at one point he left his phone in his car for an hour. I couldn't get in contact with him and I actually broke down in tears because I was worried, because at that time people were counting down to drowning. And you know, as triggering as that is to talk about, you know, the social media updates on Facebook were, I'm at this address, I've got 20 centimetres until I'm gone. Can you please come and rescue me? We know that there were lives lost. So, you know, look, I think this is, you know, potentially could be a whole nother conversation, just this one moment in time. But, the Koori Mail then, I guess the reality of not being able to print for the first time in 30 years, as hard as it was to take, we just knew that we had to do something, and that we had the space and the resources and the connections, and in particular to make sure that we honoured our cultural responsibility to reach out to as many of our Indigenous people and communities as possible to make sure that they were okay, because we know the history of placing our Indigenous peoples purposely on the outskirts of towns where they are remote and they don't have access to townships. That was a real concern for us. So we literally were in boats, delivering groceries, making sure people were okay. They were cut off by water, doing helicopter drops. It was, it was pretty full on. Like I said, not our day job, but we managed to do the best that we could.
Was that day one, or day two?
So day one and day two, when the waters were still coming in and still surrounding, I had cousins that were ringing me saying, we've got a boat. Is there any way that Koori Mail can buy some groceries? And it just snowballed from then. I have a really supportive board. It was just a phone call to say we've got to do something. They said, whatever ideas that you have, go for it. So it was boats. And then as, I think it was within the first 5 days when we had people come on the ground, like these amazing women behind us that, had all these connections, really savvy with social media. We had people who were ringing me up saying, are you Naomi? Yep. Do you need my helicopter?
Awesome.
Can you come back for my 40th birthday? Sure, I'll take your helicopter. I don't know what that means right now, but and let's remember, this is where it took so long for, and I don't know the complexities of what had happened, but the Australian Defence Force and the SES and New South Wales State Emergency just not talking to each other. So we had no choice but to accept any offers of support that came our way. And fortunately, it came in private helicopters. So we were actually pinpointing, some of our Indigenous community members in remote areas. And when I talk about remote regional areas where they were isolated, cut off by waters, sitting, up in the hills, where they actually had to do food drops by helicopter. So it was quite epic. It became a really full-blown, crisis management centre. And I think I talk a lot about the independence of the Koori Mail as an Indigenous media organisation, that we didn't wait for people to tell us if we could. We just did it. And we talk a lot about making sure we listened in those immediate hours and immediate days to what the needs were and what the voices of the community were trying to say, whether it was being rescued, whether it was getting that relief, and certainly now still providing support to recover.
And thanks for sharing that, because I knew about the hub and the more long-term commitment. I knew you mobilised quickly, but I didn't realise you mobilised right off the bat in terms of that rescue as well, and getting services and food and whatnot out to people by helicopter in remote areas. So that's an amazing story.
Yeah, and there's, just one story really quickly. There was, a local black fella that lives off grid, cut off by the roads, been washed away, recovering addict, so lives very isolated on purpose as part of his, his trauma story and his healing, and, a packet of cigarettes. He just needed a packet of cigarettes, and you wouldn't believe the amazing support, given to us by the local police, who, some police officers, were doing the rounds trying to ring people to see if they could get out there, because he was somebody who was, really kind of at risk in his own way with what he was dealing with, and for us to even consider that was important. And I know to some people might say, oh, surely he could have went without a packet of cigarettes, but for us, it was like no voice has, should be unheard here, whether it's, food supplies or getting something out to him just to help him survive. So, really tried to work down the line as best as we could.
Right, excellent. And so you talked about the immediate rescue and response, but then obviously the Koori Mail saw a need for that ongoing support and that central hub at Koori Mail headquarters. Can you just talk a little bit about that and why you kind of why that then became the central focus for the Koori Mail and the broader community. And also that the scale of that operation, because I think it's one thing, and I was really fortunate I was able to visit the hub and see it in operation, and it was truly phenomenal. The scale was truly phenomenal. And I think it's one thing to talk about it, but then to see it and see that scale is quite, I mean, it was huge. It was like a little mini town within town, basically. Yeah. But yeah, if you could just take us through, you know, mobilising that aspect and in terms of that that hub and that centre.
Yeah, I always have a giggle to myself because I'm an 80s baby and I go, oh God, I must have watched too much MASH episodes back in the day. You know, when you got home from school and there was nothing else on TV. But it really was like that, you know, and I think, you know, we talk about what our cultural responsibility is, and I think being led by an Indigenous organisation and Indigenous group of leaders is that we absolutely acknowledge that in a time of crisis and trauma, we have to have a holistic view to what it looks like to help people recover or to support them during the most traumatic time of their lives. And I think being a grassroots community organisation, it was only natural that we, I guess, approached it that way. So, you know, sure, we started off with a 1 3x3 marquee and a little sign that said, you know, put your donations here, with a bit of loaf of bread and, you know, milk and whatnot. But then we were able to reach out to people to set up makeshift triage, makeshift referrals with general practitioners and chronic disease nurses. So people would come with a cut or bruise, but if that nurse, I guess, saw that they were in a really emotionally and mental vulnerable state, they could then refer them to the next tent where there was a psych on site, there was counsellors on site, and these were people that came there voluntarily for weeks and months. We had people who set up a bodywork tent, so you could actually come and get massages all day, every day, and you know, you can get some of that general well-being and spiritual healing as well, because that was really important to us. And I mean, look, the Northern Rivers is the epitome of spiritual healing and all things, you know, yoga and whatever. So it was only kind of natural too that we attracted those type of services, which is really important because we don't know what people's needs are. So we need to acknowledge that people heal and need healing in different ways. And still to this day, we have a member of the wellbeing team that sits on site and does follow-up and referrals still to this day, some 8 months later. So it was really important for us to do that. And obviously, you know, food and supplies. So establishing the food and supply bank, we had donations of generators and gurneys and cleaning products. So it was also about that. And the well-being stuff as well, that they came to get what they physically needed to go and clean and eat and, you know, and water, but also that they were looking after their well-being as well.
And probably talk and connect.
Yeah. So we had a little, you know, like a little area as well where, you know, local mob were just coming down and making cups of tea. You know, the aunties, they can drink tea all day, and, you know, we're the ones that have to make it. You know, so they're all sitting there and people, and this isn't just about Indigenous mob, you know, this isn't just our local, you know, our local blackfellas. These are like people who prior to this event would probably never have associated with mob before. You know, and people from generations where they just didn't have that connection with our Aboriginal communities. And here they are, young and old, black and white, sitting together, having a cup of tea and just talking and crying and hugging each other and getting what they need. So, yeah, it's been a really beautiful experience amongst the tragedy.
Disaster events impact human rights in the moment and then for a long time after the initial event. What sort of human rights impacts, and touched on a number of these, have you noticed in your community?
Look, I think, and I'm not, you know, I'm not going to try and pretend I kind of know it all and know that space, but purely on our experiences the past 8 months is certainly around the lack of housing. We know that in regional country towns in regional New South Wales that this is an ongoing issue, and certainly it's been heightened during the flood event. So I guess the reality that prior to the flood, there was a severe lack of affordable housing and housing in general in our region. And then a flood comes and people lose their homes and they have absolutely nowhere to go. So a lot of people have had to move out of the area. They're still waiting to be put in temporary housing. That creates a lot of risks as well, just with dynamics of, families and communities and, also people's emotional and mental well-being as well, and how that impacts, all of a sudden you have groups of people living so closely together. While we understand that people just need a roof over their head, it can be extremely problematic when you're putting very diverse groups of people that have different needs or different vulnerabilities in such close proximity of each other. So, and I am very real about the lack of attention to an area that is prone to flooding. Where is the funding reserves for when this happens? So if this has happened in 2017 and it's happened in 1950 odd or whenever it was, where the previous floods have been so bad that we keep seeing the recurring issues coming up during these times of crisis, where is the responsibility of state government and federal government to ensure that communities and towns and regions that are at risk of natural disasters, whether it's flooding and bushfires, where are the funding reserves? Just like they just so happen to have funding reserves to send for foreign aid for wars and everything else, where are those reserves for our own communities in towns at a time of crisis? And I think that there's a lot of frustrations that lay within communities, and certainly a lot of questions at a local and state leadership level as well around how do we keep ignoring that this is happening in our regions and not having the support. For example, local fire and rescue officer who's been part of the local fire brigade for years and years and years, comes down to our hub, starts crying because he's so overwhelmed with the support that we're giving to people. And he says, Naomi, since 2017, we've had no upgrades to any of our equipment or our resources to support a flood event. So he stands there with his wealth of knowledge and experience in the role that he does there, feeling like he's got blood on his hands because people have lost their lives or because they just haven't been able to do enough to support the local community. So they're the stories that are coming out of our communities now from people who are employed to take action but can't take action because they're not being heard.
Can I jump off script and ask another question? Sorry. But in the context of human rights and rights of Indigenous peoples and connection to country, I think one of the observations, and particularly with Lismore as it floods quite regularly, is people might say, well, we've got to move town or we've got to buy back, etc. But I know from discussions with you, that's not what you want. And so what would you say to that? I mean, I guess you've said you need that funding and resourcing to address it. And now other speakers in this series have talked about the tool bag of responses to floods and the need to engage with community about what that particular community wants. So that community might not want buyback, or that community might not want to leave. And so in the context of your community, what do you see as the answer? Is it that funding and getting that support in preparation and so on? So
yeah, I think a lot of the conversations generally has been around listening to the local voices of the community when decisions are being made. Now, as an Indigenous person, when we talk, when we're invited to take a seat around the table, there's not a lot of trust that your voice is going to be heard, and that the structures and frameworks that exist in government certainly haven't served, our people since, since colonisation. So it's really hard to try and I get a grip of the idea that if we were to sit around the table, how do we get that message across in a way that we feel like we're truly being heard? And I think it has to come back to the local level. So it certainly has to come back to the local representatives, that exist in our towns and regions every single day. That the leadership within those groups of people, certainly within local council, within local, government, through our local MPs and representatives. They're the conversations that has to be more intimate, because I strongly feel that if those conversations in a more intimate environment are had, that's truly where the understanding is. So, you know, we're in a really intimate environment here together today. And obviously my hope is that just 1% of what I say today will either resonate with you or you know, make you think differently, you know, tomorrow or today. So I strongly feel that it's certainly about communicating. You know, we say, and I know this is going to sound obvious because I work in communications, but if you can't communicate about communicating, you've got nothing. I think that is absolutely the problem as well. So having these more intimate, respectful conversations around how people see things moving forward, their ideas, certainly Indigenous knowledges is a big part of how this particular region moves forward. And as an example, you know, we know long ago, you know, my cousin who works for environment, you know, he talks very passionately about the knowledge of the river systems, and having that knowledge of the river systems, that you can actually foresee how this is really problematic for our region, and that there was a reason why they were told not to build in this particular area, but also knowledges around things like vegetation. So knowing that generations and generations ago, there was particular vegetation that would purposely grow and line the river systems because it would actually naturally soak up the water and prevent water from, you know, overlapping and going into, you know, townships or areas where it was populated. So you know, and like I said, I'm not going to pretend like I can talk on behalf of the region and community, but certainly from our experiences, being on the ground and truly listening to people, I think that's where it needs to start. And then I think, you know, naturally control what you can control, what you can't, but pushing those voices and pushing those agendas through those key decision makers that have to ultimately do the right thing. And we know when we talk about politics and government, it's really hard for them to do the right thing, but making sure that they do attempt to do the right thing and then push those voices up to the channels where, you know, changes can be made. As you can tell, I'm extremely passionate, and you're probably thinking, oh God, it's lunchtime over yet, but I just, yeah, it's, I think a lot of people certainly don't know the layers and the complexities that have come out of this event, and it's yeah, it's really challenging.
What's your community's most pressing need at the moment? You're still grappling with the crisis from last summer, and there's another wet season on the way.
Yeah, I think, you know, the mechanics of it, certainly housing, certainly, you know, conversations and really clear understanding around, you know, buyback schemes and I guess how people feel about that, because I think it's, they absolutely need to be acknowledged. How they feel is really important. And housing, you know, there was a problem before the flood, there's a problem during the flood, there's going to be problems after the floods. What does regional housing opportunities look like for people who want to stay in the area, and how does that contribute to how a region is economically sustainable? You know, it's not just about the businesses that are shutting down or will never open again because of the flood. It's actually about people moving out of the area because they don't feel connected to this region now, because they don't feel supported, or they physically cannot get, you know, be housed in the area. So I think there's a lot of schooling. Yeah, exactly right. So we know a lot of people moved out of the area. So I think, you know, the mechanics of that, but also, you know, the emotional stuff, you know, that connection to a place, you know, called home. And we talked about Cabbage Tree Island being an Indigenous community that's completely wiped out. Right or wrong, they want to go back to that island. And, you know, the whispers in the beginning about, you know, government potentially using this as an opportunity to vacate them from the island, and, you know, this becomes like prime land opportunity, you know, a neighbouring island, there's a yoga retreat on there, you know, so it's, you know, people are worried that they're going to lose that connection to country and connection to home. And I think we really need to acknowledge that that cultural connection, that spiritual connection, is also a pressing need for our community, where there's a high population of Indigenous people that come from that area.
And we've got that beautiful image, which I guess is a visual representation of the First Nations female leadership that came out of this this flood event and the recovery event. And certainly Jo Hedger, who is part of this series as well from Deloitte and from the community as well, has really highlighted you know, what he saw on the ground of this phenomenal women who had not done this. I mean, it's not your day job, as you said, and for most the women that stepped up. Had not done this type of thing before, and wanting to, I guess, celebrate that and recognise it, but also, I guess, not capture it, but to take it forward and go, hang on, something absolutely, truly amazing has happened here. And it needs to be recognised, but we need to leverage that for future crises or just events in general. Can you just share a little bit about, I mean, I know you're probably too embarrassed to talk about your own leadership, but that has been recognised through awards and so on. And so, we want to call that out and congratulate you on that. But there must be other women in the community who you can share a little bit about, what they did, young, old, and how proud you are of them in that situation.
Yeah, and I think I don't talk about myself in that context because I strongly believe that everything that I am and what I represent and everything that I've become is because of those that have come before me. And they're the foundations of everything that I do every single day, is acknowledging that I am only here because of those who came before me. So when I look at this photo and I see Auntie Rose sitting front and centre there, and then I see the two sisters on either side of her, Auntie Monica and Auntie Jacqui. Auntie Monica works with the local ranger group, and Auntie Jacqui is actually a mental health worker in the area. So, mental health allows her to come down and work in the kitchen because we've got a lot of vulnerable people, some that are clients that work there. So, when I look at that, I just see how natural organising and structuring the past 8 months has been, because naturally women are nurturers, and I think in Indigenous communities as well, we take the lead in gathering people and making sure that people are okay. Not to dismiss the amazing leadership of our Indigenous men, including Joe, who's amazing. But I think, and I can't explain it. It's just such a natural thing that's happened, and we all know each other. We come from neighbouring towns and communities, and like I said, there's a beautiful mix of the young and old. Like Auntie Rose, who's right in the middle at the front there. She ran our op shop for months and months and months. Auntie Jacqui, she looks after things like mental health and people's well-being. And then we've got a few girls in there, Kira Lee and Ella Bancroft, who are just amazing, young, staunch advocates for Indigenous rights and Indigenous issues in their own way, and have these amazing connections with those demographics and generations of people where we can get messages out really quickly through social media and stuff like that. So I think when we look at a time of crisis, we absolutely have to look at the resources that are around us and how quickly we can act because of that, and making sure that we're obviously all looking after each other, but we're acknowledging that everybody has a role to play. And I talk very much about our cultural responsibility, and that certainly has been with us for the last 8 months, that we have a cultural responsibility to do this.
Now, Jacqui and I have probably taken up a lot of your time, so we do want to open to the floor for some questions. We'll probably deal with questions from the floor, and then if anyone online wants to put a question in the chat, is that right? Yep. We'll deal with chat questions second, and for the purpose of questions from the floor, we will repeat them so that people online and for the recording can hear. So have we got any questions from the audience? So I'll just repeat that question. I'll try to capture it properly, Margaret. So the question from Margaret was whether, with the impact on the floods and the loss of housing, does that mean that mob will have to leave their homes and lose connection, or what's the status of that?
Yeah, so at the moment, Lismore region in general, obviously everybody's situation is different, Indigenous, non-Indigenous. If you're a homeowner and your home is structurally sound and you can rebuild, then obviously people are choosing to rebuild. Some people have experienced, these floods for generations now, and some people have decided to up and move out of the area, because it's also about loss of jobs as well. We know that there's a lot of big companies that have shut down. So people are losing their jobs and they have no choice but to explore opportunities elsewhere. So it's definitely a case-by-case scenario, but we know that the opportunity is there certainly for people to rebuild, and people are living in tents and caravans underneath their houses or, you know, in the backyard while they rebuild. We've got an Aboriginal elder who she's a homeowner, widow, and she couldn't bear the thought of not being in her home. So she was living with a relative 20 minutes out of town, and we were all checking in on her. And then we found out she'd actually moved herself back into her home surrounded by the mold and everything like that, because she just couldn't bear not being at home. So that's certainly, that connection there is still really strong. In terms of Cabbage Tree Island, where the large portion of Aboriginal homes have now had to be pulled down and rebuild, this will take between 2 to 5 years. So the temporary housing needs for that community are really high, and they're going to be put in pods and other suitable long-term housing as well. But the government's made a commitment to rebuild and also support the rebuild of all Indigenous housing in the region as well.
So the question's essentially about the Torres Strait 8 successful decision that's recently come out from the United Nations, where that decision found that the Australian government failed in protecting some of the rights under the relevant covenant for those people and those claimants, particularly around the right to enjoy their life free from all manner of interruption, and has found that or has recommended the Australian government take action to compensate those people, but also to stop that happening again. And so the question to Naomi was, as a First Nations person, how do you feel about the decision, and what would you like to see how would you like to see the Australian government respond?
I think seeing the Australian government respond, period, is the answer. And look, like I said at the start, what you see is what you get here, and certainly we'll call things out, but I think there's certainly a lack of accountability and responsibility, particularly with the Torres Strait Islands and the rising sea levels, and how drastically that has impacted the livelihood and also the sustainability of people being able to live and occupy those lands for many more generations to come. And I've personally been on Thursday Island and visited there, and I was there for a week, and at any given time, access to telecommunications can cut out at any given time. So it was 2 days while I was up there without communications. I was up there with my 3-month-old son at a conference, and my husband was in hysterics because he couldn't get in touch with us. So when we think about, the lack of access to telecommunications in remote areas of Australia, in particular in Indigenous communities that are isolated and at risk of environmental impacts, that creates another level of problems and issues, because, for example, if they are at risk of any weather event, or if people are on a different island and they have needs, that access to telecommunications surrounding the bigger issue is extremely problematic. So I think and I very much encourage, people to get a really true understanding of why, as Indigenous peoples, we're still talking about the history of Australia and the many, many layers that exist to, that history, because it certainly impacts how not only we see our own communities around climate change and natural disasters, but it certainly opens the eyes of mainstream Australia to understand just how important this is, and that, climate change isn't just about those rising sea levels, but it's also the disruption of people being able to live off their land and eat off their lands as well. So we're seeing changes in how people can, access food and natural foods as well. And, I think that if you really kind of do the work to acknowledge and respect that these issues are real and important, and if you can visit these areas and get an understanding and talk to our local people and, and get that local knowledge. For example, Cabbage Tree Island, the area that surrounds us, the riverways, down there, we have a community cemetery. And I'll just quickly talk about this because, you know, very similar. This is impacting our community in a way where I guess things that are sacred to us are being taken away from us. So the community cemetery where generations and generations of my family are buried, but my family members were purposely buried down by the river because they weren't given the respect to be buried up high where the local members who may have passed away later and years later than my grandparents and great-grandparents, but they were given plots where they were protected from the water. Our people were purposely buried down near the river because it was like better for them to be hidden away, certainly when they passed as well. So now when those rivers rise, the first thing that we think about is what is going to happen to our family graves. Where am I going to take my son to show him where his great-grandparents and great-great-parents are down there respectfully, because that's what I have to do culturally. So I think there's, like I said, there's always so many layers. There's always an Indigenous lens to issues that are affecting, you know, our country, whether it is climate change and natural disasters. But ultimately, it's about listening. It's about sharing, it's about engaging, it's about working together and just having those really deep and meaningful, respectful conversations around why this is important to somebody. Just like any issue, we need to understand why it's important to the individual.
And I think when we interviewed Bill Mitchell as part of this series as well, off camera, we had a discussion about this decision, the Torres Strait decision, and as Bill rightly pointed out, we in Australia have, you know, a lot to thank the Torres Strait community for, you know, some really fantastic legal advocacy. Because if we think about the Mabo decision came out of that region as well. So yeah, really important decision.
Yes, yeah, I've got a couple of questions from the online audience. So the first is, what advice would you give to communities in Victoria, Tasmania and other parts of New South Wales who are facing a similar flooding crisis this week as your community? If you can, yeah. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. If
so the question was around the current flooding in Victoria and parts of New South Wales and Tasmania, and if Naomi would offer any advice to those communities as they're facing coming days and weeks and months their own recovery and rebuild.
I think certainly the power is in community. I think that if you feel like you're not getting the answers or the direction, you know, from the powers that be, that you certainly, you know, have to work within your community to support your community this time. And I can only speak of the past 8 months where that has really been what saved people's lives in our area, and not just what we're doing down at the Koori Mail, but certainly the other flood relief hubs as well, is that it absolutely has been power in the community. So making sure that people are communicating amongst community groups and doing the best that they can to band together and provide that support. And also make sure that you keep using your voice, because I think, you know, what's happened, you know, in Lismore and the surrounding region certainly has put the conversation back on the map, where we have to make the government accountable and make sure that they absolutely do better. And I think that if other communities now, you know, during this week and the next coming weeks are at risk, we have to make sure that those voices are still being heard, and that we're literally banging on the doors of government to make sure that they're putting the right people in those positions where those decisions need to be made, because it's absolutely evident that they don't have the right people in those positions now. And unfortunately, people have lost lives, people have lost their connection to country and their homes. So I think that this is really brought to the surface amongst all the other issues that exist within government, that there is a clear issue around disaster recovery and crisis management in Australia.
Any more questions?
Good question. Thank you. And just firstly, just thanks for your time. I mean, it's quite remarkable. It's a remarkable summer as we go into it.
Yeah.
Just interested, like, go into before the floods, and you've obviously found it really interesting. You talked about the independent relationship. That doesn't happen by mistake, right? Like, you earn trust and respect in the community. Can you share, like, I'm interested to know, where are you now? Like, how's that relationship with the community changed?
Yeah, certainly. I think. Oh, sorry. Yeah. So, it's a process. Oh gosh.
Apologies. So the and I don't want to interrupt the flow,
No,
but
that's
the question was around the Koori Mail having built up that relationship and trust within the community during this process, and the question is, where is that relationship at now? And you could just
Yeah, I think one of the things that we acknowledge now is that we absolutely took a chance on the Koori Mail having that reputation, not just locally, but as a national media organisation, a national newspaper. We took a chance on our reputation that if people heard what we were doing, they'd want to help us. And it's not an easy thing to do, certainly in a leadership position, to basically put the organisation's name on the line, you know, from anything from the GoFundMes and the fundraisers to philanthropic support, certainly the donations. But I think what was really evident was that people trusted that an organisation that is a grassroots organisation that's been running for, you know, 30 plus years now, that we might know a little bit of what to do. And like I said, the mechanics of, you know, rescue and relief and recovery is not our day job, but for us, it's certainly about community and being there for our community and using our resources and networks that way to generate the support. So certainly a very strong, we've been received well by our local Indigenous community, so very strong community connection that way. But in terms of the non-Indigenous community and non-Indigenous support near and far and nationally, it's been absolutely incredible. And I think, you know, that only happens when you make people feel like, we talk about culturally safe spaces for our mob, but we make people feel like they're in a culturally safe space with us. And that's something that I'm very, you know, I feel very strongly about in my leadership position, is that I not only have a responsibility to make sure any Indigenous person that works for me or any work that we do in our own space is culturally safe, but I also have a cultural responsibility to make sure that non-Indigenous people who want to share and connect and help and work with us, that I make it culturally safe for them as well, because of the ongoing, I guess, you know, misunderstandings and you know, relationships that still exist between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia. So that's really important for me. Really quickly, I'll share a story with you just around, you know, your question is that, for example, we've got the solicitor across the road, you know, non-Indigenous solicitor, who's never engaged with blackfellas before, ever in his life. And my understanding is always, I don't know his story. So before I make judgment, I need to understand that he's come from a generation and generations of people that, you know, just didn't engage with blackfellas before. I had to go and see him about a legal matter, and he offered to do it, you know, pro bono for me, which is great. Come in, Naomi, sit down. And he's sitting back and he's looking out his window, which we can get a view of the Koori kitchen, which provides food supplies and hot meals and everything every day. He's been having his lunch there every day since the flood, right? And he's sitting there and he's, you know, even as an Aboriginal woman, you know, just I've got to take that deep breath before I walk into his office, because I don't know how I'm going to be received by him. And that's the reality of who I am as an Indigenous person. So I go in and sit down. And he's like, you know, before we get into it, Naomi, I just want to tell you, every day I go home to my wife and I tell her that I get to have lunch with the Aborigines. And I just, right? And I just went, it was like my life flashed before my eyes, and you know, and I just went, shut your mouth, Naomi, just shut your, you know, like I had a choice in that moment whether to react in a way where it became then, you know, a different conversation, or I had a choice to go, his body language and even just him saying that in a way where he doesn't understand the, you know, the term that he's used and how he's expressed it because of perhaps how he's been raised, and I can't fix that. What I can fix and appreciate and understand is that he was proud to be around blackfellas and that he was proud to have lunch with the Aborigines. And I had a choice to make him feel comfortable and acknowledge that in that moment, And that's the beginning of a relationship with an Aboriginal person, and certainly me with an older white man, that now every time we see each other, you know, it's almost high fives. And, you know, so for what that was worth in that moment, I had a choice. And I think the impact of what we've been able to give the community, not just in food, water supplies, but also providing a culturally safe space for everybody, is something that I was, you know, and still really proud to see. The diverse group of people that have now engaged with us and are comfortable that this particular flood hub is being led by an Aboriginal organisation.
What services have you noticed are missing from the conversation? Yep.
I think one of the things that is coming across a lot is just people being really confused about what services to go to. So it's either a matter of all of the services being presented and creating chaos because people don't know exactly what they're here for and what their purpose is in that moment, or not enough services for people to navigate, you know, their individual needs and the issues that they're facing. I think overarching is certainly around an overarching crisis management structure. I think that would be the biggest thing that people would like to see, is that in the event that this happens again, first of all, who is going to come in and make sure that we're going to be okay? And the layers of that could be the evacuation centres, could be the rescue and relief, could be the immediate information that they need around where to go to. And then obviously the other layers of that is, well, who are the specific people that we can talk to, and also, you know, thinking about the different groups of people's needs, like disability, elderly, that type of stuff. So I think if we kind of get this right first before we even consider all of this, that's what people would like to see. Yeah.
Well, Naomi, is there any key messages you want to leave us with that you haven't touched on already?
Gosh, I think examples like today, creating the opportunity for people's experiences during a time that only they've experienced is really important, and not, the elevation of voices that haven't gone through what people have gone through. And I think it's only obvious that, too many times we've had people try to speak on issues where they've had no lived experience. And I think that's extremely sensitive to Indigenous people as well, is that the only people that should be sitting around the table with the right key decision makers that can take action and do it responsibly and quickly and effectively are the people that have lived that experience. And I think certainly in our communities, we've got reconstruction committees, and we've got, there's a committee for everything now over the past 8 months as a result of what's happened down there. But the people that are sitting on those communities aren't necessarily local people that have gone through it. And I think we really need to start getting to know our own communities better, and respectfully acknowledging that the people who have the loudest voices in our communities certainly know what they do, what they're doing.
Well, Naomi, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you
for coming, for sharing your water story with us, but sharing your leadership as well, which is so clearly evident with everything that you've spoken about today. So we're incredibly grateful for your time and everything that you've done and continue to do. We do have a small gift for you, just to say thank you. Which includes, and I have some former colleagues online, so they're going to laugh, but includes some honey from my own backyard.
Oh, thank you.
And my former colleagues will be going, oh, don't let her talk about that. But no, we're incredibly grateful for your time. We're incredibly grateful for you being part of this series. I think I also want to make a shout out to Sarah McCown, who's a partner in our planning and environment team, who's also been part of this series. Julie Brooke, Joe Hedger, who we've mentioned, Bill Mitchell, and Andrew Gissing for their time in these interviews that we've run as pre-recorded interviews. I think from HopgoodGanim's perspective, and Caxton, if I could speak on behalf of Jacqui as well, what we wanted to do with this series was share these water stories as part of National Water Week, but from different perspectives and different disciplines and different jurisdictions, because these environmental issues are requiring multidisciplinary responses. And by having these discussions, and by people like Naomi sharing her experience and now her wealth of knowledge in this space, we are going to come up with better solutions to these issues. And you know, particularly in the context of that human rights lens, which we keep kind of bringing up over and over, is it's so important that those with the greatest needs in this space and in response and in preparedness for environmental disasters receive that support. So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to our online guests as well. And
can I just say one thing? And I just want to thank everybody in the room, and certainly thank you know, you guys for supporting me when I've needed some support over the past 8 months, and to be approached by you and to be heard during this time, you know, has been really, really special and really important to how I've then been able to, you know, go back and manage situations. And I just want to thank the incredible work that you all do, and even just feeling very safe and comfortable in this space as well. I think, you know, obviously it's a testament to who you all are individually. So thank you very, very much for making me feel welcome in this space.
Excellent. Thanks everyone for your time.